All right, now I want to. I think I'm going to wrap it up with this one and just make im- some im- some empirical observations about the differences between state and non-state defense. Uh, One thing, though, the proviso here is that in the social sciences, empiricism has limited value. And so, for instance, I remember talking to a guy recently, and we were discussing this, and he said, "Well, I think that market defense it's a worthy idea, and I think it should be tried." Okay, so give him props for that. But then he said, "But obviously," and I think I said, "Well, how about I'm kind of hoping like Wyoming or Montana will become a free market. I have no reason to assume this is about to happen or anything. I'm just in my fantasy world." And he said, "Well, that wouldn't be a fair test. It would have to be someplace on the coast because if it was in the middle of the country, it would get all the benefits of being defended by the rest of the United States." So he said perhaps Oregon or Washington. And I think this belies the fact that wherever a society is, it is contingent on the local circumstances. So even if we were to put it in Oregon on the coast, look, the Pacific Ocean is actually a fairly good barrier. uh, if we were to put uh, anarchy society on the coast of Oregon and it was not attacked ever, that wouldn't in and of itself prove anything really. Uh, it could still be claimed, well, it's it's maybe it borders Canada and the United States. Both those countries are not aggressive and going to attack them. Although I guess the United States is pretty aggressive, but not against white people, so I guess it would be safe. Uh, and on the other hand, if you said, well, to test it, we're going to put it in a situation that's super volatile, so in an area, I don't know, like Central Asia or some part of Africa that is always at war, and all the entire area is filled with warring states and warring non-states. And you put it in that situation and it got assaulted, and there was horrible violence, and then you concluded, well, look, it failed. But just as easily could say that had there been a state there, it would have failed. So there, there's a severe limit to the how much you can tell from empiricism. I mean, I don't think you can prove it either way, but there is some suggestive evidence here, and I think for me, the best examples I can think of are basically in regards to the New World versus the Old World. If you look at the New World, the pre-Columbian New World, you have societies that are both have states and societies that don't have states, and the scale basically goes the entire gamut. You have in what is today the United States. Uh, I mean, most of the in the American psyche, most of the Indians we think about were essentially stateless. So when we talk about even groups like the Iroquois, we call them the Six Nations, but they didn't have the power to tax. They didn't have the power to legislate. The leaders of that society were basically what we would call natural elites. They didn't have executive power. The chiefs could not order people to do anything. Uh, and most of the societies in the United States were close to that, or even more anarchic than that, explicitly so. If you read any sociology books about most, not all, but most of the Native American groups in the United States, they did not have states. But if you go to Mesoamerica, especially like Mexico, we have not only states, but super autocratic centralized states like the Aztec that had a central ruler and a huge military and a bureaucracy and all the trappings of statism that you can imagine. And the thing is uh, and also the Inca and numerous others, but then also other parts of Mesoamerica were essentially stateless. Well, we have examples of all these societies engaging in military action against Europeans. And the record is actually the opposite of what status would claim. So if you're a status and you look at the map of the New World in 1492, you would have to say, well, the Aztec and the Inca, obviously, they will be the best at resisting the Spanish. They have all the apparatus of states. They have standing armies. They have taxation. They have a centralized ruler who can direct from above, and they have a military establishment. They have generals. They have a militaristic nobility basically, and even a warlike centralized religion, and vast cities, and metropolis and thousands. I remember seeing estimates that the Aztecs fully mobilized 500,000 soldiers, 500,000, an army that would be huge even by European standards from centuries later. And the Inca, similarly, the Inca Civil War, each side had 300,000 or 400,000 soldiers. So you would look at that, and then you'd look at, say, the Algonquin in northeast United States, say, oh, well, they live in wigwams, they don't have states, they don't have standing armies, they don't have taxation, they don't have any centralization at all. Their chiefs are just leaders that people follow or don't follow depending on how they gauge their effectiveness. And looking at this, every statist out there would have to conclude, oh, the Aztec, they're gonna be way more effective at resisting European onslaught. And it's completely, exactly the opposite. When Cortez invaded Mexico, he very easily took over that country. It took like 2 years, less than 2 years, 18 months, something like that. And it's interesting because Cortez could probably not be considered a state. He was a private mercenary. When Cortez invaded, he did not pay for it with taxes. He was not the governor of Cuba. He was a private citizen. He borrowed money from lenders. He hired people. He had contracts. All his conquistadors, they were all on contract. So it was actually an example of a stateless military overthrowing and conquering a state apparatus. And all the pitfalls of centralization were apparent with the Aztec because their leader just made a mistake. He did not act appropriately. And when he did make decisions, it tied the hands of all the other Aztec who had to fall in line with whatever, he was saying. And this was during Montezuma, and actually after he was dethroned, his successors, the same thing. And what's interesting is that, Cortez only had, I think, a couple hundred conquistadors. That he had many thousands of local Indians who helped him, who made it possible. But it's interesting because after he conquered Mexico, after a year or two, he invaded Guatemala. And this time, of course, he had triple or quadruple the number of Spaniards and many, many times more Indians. And, of course, in this case, he had all the local knowledge of the Indians and all their support, and he'd been in the country for a couple years at that point, and he had every reason to expect to win. But when he invaded Guatemala, there are no states in Guatemala. All right, it was primitive, stateless tribes. And what ended up happening is a couple months later, he staggered back to Mexico, barely alive, with only a tiny handful of what he'd gone in with. So there's a I think as good as an example as you can get, because you have the same assailant, Cortez, Spanish conquistadors. In the first event, he fights a centralized state, perhaps the most centralized in Mesoamerica, as centralized as any in the old world, and he defeats them. And then a year later, with all of their power behind him and more of his own, he invades a stateless society and gets his ass kicked. And they never conquer. I mean, Guatemala, the areas of it that weren't that didn't have city-states in them, basically never came under Spanish rule, or if they did, hundreds of years later. And we look at North America, the Native American tribes, the ones without states, resisted very effectively the European aggression. And it should be pointed out that when the English were fighting, and the English and the Americans were fighting the Algonquins in the 18th and 19th centuries, this is 300 or 400 years after Cortez. And so the Europeans at that time had vastly more powerful technology at their disposal than did Cortez. Many times more powerful, and yet they did worse. The Algonquins annihilated several European armies. Just ask General Braddock, okay? He can tell you. Many times, and the military effectiveness against these decentralized tribes was extremely poor, and it goes all the way to the extreme of you still have a tiny, tiny band of Apache effectively resisting the U.S. military into the late 1880s. In the 1870s, the United States became the biggest industrial economy in the world, bigger than England, bigger than any country in Europe, the richest, most advanced country. And yet there is still this little population of completely impoverished Stone Age hunter-gatherers who they have a hard time coercing into doing what they want. And I actually got that idea, not I don't have it with me, but there's a book titled "The First Armies," and it's about the first armies that states had. But actually, the first chapter they have a picture, taken in the 1880s of this little wigwam. It's like a hovel, but it's in the middle of this desert. And there are two Apaches outside of it. And it said, you had a non-state military force, the Apache, who did not have a state. Geronimo was not a king. He wasn't even a chief, actually, who could effectively resist the United States federal government. And that is very telling. And they make out, they say, hey, when you don't have a state, people, when they fight, they don't squander their resources. They don't do things that they think are stupid. And they are very adaptable. If in World War I is probably the classic example, but you see this all the time where, generals go and they order their troops to do something and it has a disastrous consequence, and then they just do it again and they do it again and they do it again because the generals don't get killed usually, and they, what's the worst? They might get fired or something, but probably not even that. They'll probably win a medal, and they just order their troops to do it again, and they don't change very quickly. They change extremely slowly. Even the militaries that we have considered very innovative, they're only innovative relative to other militaries, which is to say they're not very innovative. 99% of what they do is the same. If they just change 1 or 2%, that makes them, on the cutting edge. Whereas organizations that are decentralized, that aren't reliant on coercion, they basically change immediately. And this happened like Pontiac in his rebellion could not just tell his soldiers to assault a fortress because too many of them would die, and they would just be like, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to squander our lives for some frontal assault. And so there are more examples. If you look, I mentioned in another video the Franco-Prussian War. The French state completely failed in stopping the Prussians, but the resistance of just the French populace caused such enormous problems, logistical problems mostly. They didn't so much defeat the Prussians in pitched battles, but by wrecking their supplies and stuff, that caused such a huge hemorrhage of resources that Bismarck and Moltke were actually pleased that the French government finally gave up when it did, because if they hadn't within the next few weeks, there probably would have been a crisis that would have entailed Bismarck losing his position, and probably Moltke as well. So there are many more examples, but I think the Colombian one is the most telling. So, all right, that's it.